Bing Crosby was one of the most beloved entertainers of all time, dominating the silver screen, music charts, and airwaves from the 1930s to 1960s. Yet despite all his success, Crosby's personal life was filled with hardship, tragedy, and controversy. This is the tragic real-life story of Bing Crosby. Bing Crosby's early career in the mid-1920s saw him performing with a musical trio called the Rhythm Boys. It was during this time that Crosby's love for jazz took center stage, and he showcased his scat singing skills and jazz-style phrasing. By the time Crosby had hit it big in the early 1930s, copycat Crosbys were beginning to appear, from Perry Como to Dean Martin. As one musician said at the time, all the singers tried to be Crosbys. You were either a high Crosby or a low Crosby. However, as the iconic crooner was rising to the top, he was dealt a blow that almost derailed everything: a battle with laryngitis. Indeed, listening to Bing Crosby's early records of the 20s and 30s reveal a certain hoarseness to his voice, which seems to have coalesced as a result of his vocal problems. Crosby's troubles eventually led him to developing a node on one of his vocal cords in 1931, and while doctors told Crosby to rest, the star refused and instead chose to carry on singing and drinking, which only did him further damage. Around the mid-1930s, Crosby's voice became lower, and he lost his ability to hit the high notes. As a result, he abandoned his scat-style jazz sound and focused instead on ballads. Luckily, these songs were more suited for mass appeal, and in turn, Crosby became known as the voice of a nation. The early years of Bing Crosby's career were filled with both success and love. In 1929, the singer met his biggest flame, Dixie Lee, when Lee was already a rising actress in her own right at Fox Studios. The pair tied the knot on September 29, 1930, with Lee resigning from her career as a silver screen icon in order to start a family with Crosby. They settled in Toluca Lake, Los Angeles in 1936, snagging a beautiful estate that sprawled across 4 acres. Unfortunately for Crosby and his family, tragedy struck in 1943 when a fire destroyed their home and most of their personal possessions. The $250,000 fire occurred in early January, after Lee and the kids were taking down Christmas tree decorations, resulting in a short circuit that ignited the tree. The damage was catastrophic, destroying Crosby's horse racing and golf trophies, as well as his prized collection of musical recordings. Thankfully for Crosby, there was one small silver lining to all this. He managed to salvage a charred sports shoe from the remains of his dressing room, which miraculously still contained an unharmed $2,000 of cash race earnings. Although Dixie Lee was once an entertainer herself, her relationship with the spotlight was much more complex and destructive than Bing Crosby's. In fact, Lee didn't duck out of public life just to help her husband's career. She also did it because she was deeply uncomfortable in front of the camera. As it turned out, leaving the limelight wasn't all the former star needed. In his memoir, Dixie and Bing's son Gary Crosby wrote, "My mother was the kind of person who needed to hear, 'Sweetheart, darling, I love you,' and he just couldn't do it." She often turned down her husband's invitations to join him on movie sets or parties, but this also had an effect on her well-being. Gary Crosby further revealed, "I think she got lonely because Dad was working all the time." While Bing Crosby managed to kick his alcohol addiction to the curb after marrying Dixie, his wife found solace in the bottle. In a 2014 documentary, Bing's daughter Mary revealed, "It got so that she didn't leave the house and she would pass out and the kids would come home. She'd be, on the floor, and I think that's permanently scarring on just about every level for anybody." Sadly, Dixie Lee's alcohol abuse didn't have a lasting impact on just herself. Along with the psychological scars she most likely gave her children, it also had physical consequences for the couple's 2 twin sons, Dennis and Phillip Crosby. The twin Crosby brothers were victims of fetal alcohol syndrome. Heartbreakingly, because the issue wasn't discussed at the time, neither Lee or Bing knew how to help their children. Eventually, all of Bing's sons from his marriage to Lee became alcoholics, and by the time Dennis was 56, he had died by suicide from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. At Dennis's memorial service, Gary Crosby said, "When my mother died, I saw the light go out of his eyes. As far as I'm concerned, he's been trying to get back to her ever since." Although Bing Crosby had begun a family with Dixie Lee, he had done so just as he solidified his status as an A-lister, and as a result, the star was often away from home. It's something that the world-famous crooner admitted near the end of his life as well. Speaking with Barbara Walters in 1977, Bing looked back on his time as a father.
I was very busy then, making 3-4 pictures a year, had the radio and records, and they were in boarding schools, most of their high school years.
If that's not all, Bing also seems to have been obsessed with the idea that his children would grow up corrupted by greed, which is often the norm with celebrity kids. As his son Gary Crosby once revealed, he always said he didn't want any Hollywood kids in the house. He was frightened to death that we were going to become what his idea of rich kids were. But Bing's obsession only pushed the boys away. It was only during Bing's second marriage to his wife Katharine Grant that he finally kicked his paternal instincts up a notch. The singer's youngest son, Nathaniel Crosby, confirmed to The Express, "As far as raising kids, he didn't have a clue. I can't say what happened with my father's first family. I believe he had more time to spend with us as his career was less of a priority later in life." Throughout his career, Bing Crosby presented an idyllic image of himself to the masses. As the singer's second wife, Katharine, once said, "Everyone in the world was in love with Bing Crosby." If you weren't obsessed with Bing at the time, you probably saw him as a bit of a square and an old-school crooner. Regardless of which side you were on, however, one thing was for certain: Bing Crosby was harmless. But that perception wouldn't last forever. After Bing's death in 1977, his public persona was dealt a massive blow after his eldest son, Gary Crosby, published a memoir in 1983, which detailed his father's abusive tendencies. Specifically, he claimed that Bing would mock Gary based on his appearance and beat him whenever he gained weight. While Bing's other children came in for their fair share of abuse too, however, Dennis Crosby explained at the time that Gary frequently came in for the worst of it. Phillip Crosby, meanwhile, downplayed his brother's claims. Nonetheless, Gary would stick to his narrative for years to come, even revealing in 1987, "As far back as I can remember in my lifetime, the earliest childhood memory that I have, I don't remember a time when terror, bewilderment, and anxiety and despair weren't on my shoulders constantly." When Gary Crosby published his harrowing memoir in 1983, the A-list crooner wasn't alive to witness the devastating blow that followed. His son, Lindsay Crosby, sided with his brother, confirming the allegations of abuse. As People magazine revealed at the time, Lindsay's endorsement was surprising, since, by most accounts, he had been Bing's favorite child. When their father was still alive and the boys were already adults, it seems like Bing put time and energy into trying to make sure his sons didn't go astray. In fact, while Lindsay was struggling with alcohol and depression, Bing, concerned for his son's health, considered placing him in a psychiatric ward. Lindsay reportedly rejected Bing's pleas for help and sadly never recovered from his mental health issues. In December 1989, Lindsay died by suicide after learning the family inheritance he had was gone. The youngest of Bing and Dixie Lee's children had battled alcoholism and depression for years, along with the considerable strain of living in the shadow of his famous father. If you or anyone you know is having suicidal thoughts, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-TALK, 1-800-273-8255. After years of loneliness coupled with decades of alcohol abuse, Bing Crosby's wife, Dixie Lee, was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in June 1952, at only 40 years old. Even more tragic was Bing's absence when his wife passed that same year. Lee's doctors had decided not to let her know the cancer was terminal, and her husband subsequently jetted off to Paris for a scheduled movie shoot, so as not to raise suspicion anything was wrong. Because Bing Crosby was such a star, the singer didn't even have peace on the day of his wife's funeral. Gary Crosby later explained, "It was a freaking circus. Through it all, it was like he was alone." In an ironic twist of fate, Dixie Lee's passing brought the family closer together, if only for a brief period of time. As for Bing himself, the crooner has been quoted as saying, "I will never talk about my grief at losing her. I believe grief is the most private emotion a human being can have, and I'm going to keep mine that way." Based on Gary Crosby's scathing memoir, it seems that one thing is for certain about Bing Crosby. The iconic singer never found it easy to express his emotions. This fact is something Barbara Walters touched upon too during her 1977 interview with Bing, when she elaborated on the public's perception of the singer.
This picture of a man who finds it very hard to give or receive emotion.
Bing shrugged off these allegations at the time, calling himself a, quote, surface fella. Yet his second wife, Catherine, can attest to her late husband's stoic nature. Speaking about his relationship with his son Harry, she explains, "He started shaking hands with Harry when Harry was 4. I said, 'What are you doing? You hug him.'" And it appears that this sense of stoicism stayed with Bing until the day he died on a golf course in October 1977. Speaking to The Express, his youngest son, Nathaniel, recalled being with his father during his final moments. And even then, there was no final confession of love before his sudden death from a heart attack. Nathaniel revealed, "His last words weren't particularly memorable. He said, 'That was a great game of golf, fellas,' and then, 'Let's go have a Coca-Cola.'" Throughout Bing's lengthy career, the legendary crooner put out an incredible 1,200 tunes. The star covered every class of song over the years, from hymns to light opera to R&B. Crosby's greatest hit, however, is almost certainly the holiday classic, White Christmas. Bing Crosby first recorded the track in May 1942, with the song's estimated sales hitting around 50 million copies worldwide. Afterwards, White Christmas found its way into the first ever Guinness Book of World Records in 1955 as the best-selling single of all time, and held that title for decades to come. Although Crosby's legacy remains, has this long and impressive career been overshadowed by one transcendent moment of beloved holiday cheer? Some seem to think so. As record producer Ken Barnes so succinctly puts it, history doesn't see Bing as a trailblazer. History sees him as the guy who comes out every year and sings White Christmas. Luckily, Bing himself never worried about the song. In 1977, Barbara Walters pressed to find out if Crosby was sick of his own Christmas classic.
No, I could never be sick of it. I just fear that people will be sick of it.
But if nothing else, it's clear that Bing Crosby would find solace in the fact that all these years later, his legendary Christmas gift just keeps on giving. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.